Stop the world!
Welcome to another video edition of Stop the World. I'm David Rowe.
And I'm Justin Bassey.
So today we've got two gentlemen who need a little introduction. The first is Jason Healey. Now I'm going to read off my script because he's got such a resume that there's a few things that I need to list here. Senior Research Scholar at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, founding member of both the Office of the National Director, Cyber Director at the White House and the first cyber command in the world, the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Defense in 1998, where he was one of the early pioneers of cyber threat intelligence.
Yes, and of course, Dave, he is also a senior fellow here at ASPE.
I forgot that part, sorry, yes.
Very, very important. It's his most important role, as I'm sure he would say. But he's speaking with retired Admiral Mike Rogers. He also needs little introduction, but he's currently a senior advisor at Trusted Future. And he, of course, was a former commander of the US Cyber Command and director of the US National Security Agency. Mike served in the US Navy for almost 4 decades, 37 years, and retired from naval service in 2018 after rising to the rank of 4-star admiral.
So Jay and Mike are going to talk about Mike's career as a surface warfare officer in his early days, how he made the transition to the world of intelligence, how signals intelligence has changed over time, which of course it has, and whether it will stay the same in decades to come. Or will artificial intelligence result in a shift, as we're seeing in many fields?
It really is a brilliant conversation. They also go into the connection between intelligence and warning. And of course, within the Australian context, we've just gone through a period of our assessment changing, that we no longer have a 10-year warning time. And so the conversation goes into the role of intelligence within warning and whether the complexity of warning is even more difficult in the current age compared to previous eras.
Yep, it's a cracking discussion. You couldn't find two more qualified minds to have it. So we'll hand over to Jason and Mike.
Really excited to be here today with Admiral Mike Rogers.
Thanks.
Sir, so you had a great career, 37 years in the US Navy. And of course, we all know you as an intelligence cryptologic professional, but you started as a surface warfare officer. And so I teach at Columbia University, and most of my students, because we're a graduate school, are mid-career changers, right? They're coming in and they're saying, hey, I want to do something different. I want to go towards cyber or intelligence. I'm always fascinated about those transition points in people's career. So we're starting maybe a little more personally than some of the listeners are expected to. But can you walk me through, right, how did that happen a little bit? And we talked a little bit about this yesterday, and it sounds like it was a very interesting and important part of your career.
So first, I was very fortunate in the sense that I knew as a small boy. Literally, when I was in 6th grade, I'm 11 years old, and I'm reading stories of the sea, and it just blew me away. And I told my parents, I am going to be a naval officer. I'm going to drive ships for a living. When I was 11 years old, they told my parents this is what I was going to do. So,
did you grow up near the coast?
I grew up in Chicago, so on the shores of a big lake, but not the ocean. I tried to get in the Naval Academy. My grades aren't good enough. I tried to get a ROTC scholarship. My grades aren't good enough. But I go to ROTC. Ultimately, I get a scholarship, and I start down this journey, and I start as a surface warfare officer. Because again, ships were, as a kid, I'm thinking, hey, that's the dream. I want to be a commanding officer on a ship.
Don't tell anyone this. It's our secret, but if I could have done it again, I might have gone Navy.
Well, I'll tell you I'll get to answer your question, but the one thing I tell people is the fact that I started as a ship driver, that made all the difference in my ability to deliver as an intelligence professional. And it really helped as I found myself then much later becoming more senior, and I'm trying to shape this vision for how the DoD is going to execute cyber operations. And I'm thinking literally back to maneuver and fires. I'm thinking exactly back to when I was a junior officer. But in any event, I'm on a destroyer out of Norfolk, brand new, 963, a Spruance-class destroyer, new at the time. So I'm feeling great. Hey, El Salvador, Libya, Beirut, Grenada was there for the invasion. So I got to do a lot of great things, and I got a lot of operational experience. And yet, I watched the behaviors of the officers around me, particularly the seniors.
Oh my gosh.
And I just didn't like it. I thought they were abusive, they were loud, they were screamers. This was at a time period when it seemed to me to be the more you scream, the more you seem to care, and therefore that's considered to be being an intensive kind of. That's a good thing. I still remember being off Beirut on a 8 or 9 month combat deployment. I'm running the naval gunfire teams, and we're firing combat naval gunfire to support the Marines in the aftermath of the bombing of the Beirut barracks. This is like November of 83. And my commanding officer, great guy, had great respect for him. He's a commander. When I'm an ensign, lieutenant, I'm thinking he's ancient. He's probably 40 years old. But he's a great guy. I had a lot of respect for him. My ship on this combat deployment, we did Grenada and then Beirut, we had a Commodore embarked, the next level of command over, but we were the flagship. This guy and the officers on his staff just abused the crap out of my CO. I mean, literally, we would be on the bridge on his own ship, and they would be screaming at him. And I'm thinking to myself, why are you guys doing this at all? But if you're going to do it, why are you doing it in front of the entire bridge watch team? Yeah. And I came back from this 9-month deployment. I was really strung out. As I said, I ran the naval gunfire teams, and because we had to have a round on the target 10 minutes from the first call of the spotter, I remember my commanding officer literally says to me, "Mike, we need you to sleep in combat." So I spent 4 months at sea, sleeping behind the radar racks, so that I could get shaken up with, "Hey, Lieutenant, we just got a call for fire from the spotter. We're getting the team together. We got a naval gunfire mission." I'm like, "Okay, let's go." I came back from that deployment. I said to myself, "Look, I love the Navy, but I can't. This is not what I just can't be like this. If this is what it takes to become a commanding officer, this is where you're going to be treated." And I was originally going to get out, and then I come back from this deployment, and I have a dinner with a guy who had been one of my ROTC instructors, who had subsequently transferred to the Norfolk area. He was a P3 pilot. And I have dinner with he and his wife. And
P3, the anti-submarine warfare aircraft, yeah.
And I have dinner with him, and he says to me, "You seem really worn out. You seem really unhappy. And Mike, you loved the Navy. You were always this motivating about surface warfare. You were the battalion commander. You were this." And I just said, I did a combat deployment that you should be thinking, "Hey, I'm super motivated about." And yet I was motivated about it, but part of it was I can't believe the behaviors I was seeing. And I told him, "Hey, I'm getting out." His wife, an amazing woman, his wife says to me, "Mike, I thought you liked the Navy." And I said, "I love the Navy. And I love going to sea," which I did. I love going to sea. But I just don't like the ethos and the leadership style of being a surface warfare officer. And she says, "Was that the only thing you have to do in the Navy? Is there another way to go to sea?" I literally started thinking. She starts me down a whole different road. And I go see my commanding officer, and he says, "Well, have you thought about choosing another specialty?" Again, show you the way people have an impact on your life that you don't really realize. I identified 3 specialties in the Navy where I thought I could continue to go to sea, and I thought potentially what I had done on the ship might have relevance. I then transferred to shore duty in Washington, D.C. I happened to be in the building where at that time, the Navy Annex next to the Arlington Cemetery and the hill above the Pentagon, it's been bulldozed now, and then the cemetery has been extended. But that happened to be the building where all of these communities, their detailers, the people that sent people to different jobs, were located. And I went to public affairs, I went to intelligence, and I went to cryptology. And I said, "Here's my background. Would this be applicable to your specialty? What might I do if I were selected in your specialty? And do you think that my skill set potentially would be of value? Or would you tell me, hey, you're wasting my time?" Public affairs said to me, "Hey, Lieutenant, you were not a collateral duty public affairs officer." I wasn't. "And you don't have a degree in journalism. You're probably not the kind of guy we would be looking for." Intelligence said to me, "Well, you got a good background for us, but when I asked them to describe what they do, this guy literally says to me, well, I can't really tell you because it's highly classified, but we get a lot of awards." And I just thought, okay, this guy clearly doesn't know Mike Rogers. I really got zero interest in that crap. And then I went to the cryptologic arena, and I run into an officer, never met him before. Says to me, I think you had a great background. I think your skill set would be very applicable.
That's great.
And then he says to me, hey, would you like some help perhaps write? Because you had to actually write a package and you had to go before a board to be screened because you were competing for an open slot. And he says to me, you want me to help you write your package? I've never met this guy before in my life. And I'm going, wow, okay, sir. He was a commander and I was a lieutenant.
And for listeners that don't know the U.S. military system, or probably any military system, right, it's a privilege to be able to go and talk to the detailers. And I've never heard a story where they're like, hey, you know, let me lay the path down for you.
Yeah, but just think if one of them, if Intel had said to me, yeah, here's the background, I might have gone that way. What if cryptology, I'd met a different individual who had said to me, hey, what we do is highly classified and very sensitive. I really can't go into the details about it. It's just amazing. It always reminds me the difference. And my ROTC instructor's wife in that conversation at that dinner that night in Norfolk, people always make a huge difference in your life. So ultimately, I wound up as a cryptologist. The Navy is the only service that differentiates at the officer level between intelligence officers and signals intelligence or cryptologists. SIGINT being a much narrower aspect of intelligence, which is intelligence being multiple disciplines, human intelligence, signals intelligence, imagery, etc. SIGINT being very much more narrow, but it's a reflection of the Navy's history of the Battle of Midway, where the Navy's code breakers, the forerunners of what we call cryptologists or information warfare officers today, broke the code of the Japanese Navy, were able to tell Nimitz on this date, at this spot, you're going to find the following ships, and here's their mission. They're going to try to occupy Midway, and they're going to try to bring you out and destroy what's left of the Pacific.
JN-25B?
Yeah.
Yeah, and for me in Air Force, we started, and it was a separate Air Force specialty code for signals intelligence, so we were dedicated, and now it's generalists. Yeah. And I know there's going to be advantages to each side of that. Last night you shared an anecdote a little bit about kind of surprising assignment that you had. Yeah. Can you maybe share a little bit about that anecdote?
So we were talking about, hey, what kind of jobs, do you ever get a job where you thought, oh man, my career is derailed? So I said I had left that ship and I went to Washington, D.C. I had been working with what we call the detailer. That's the individual ashore who manages your career, decides what jobs you're going to. That individual, as I was on my destroyer, and remember at the time, everything's by phone, or you physically got to drive up to Washington to meet him. And that individual had been telling me, and it worked out great. We had negotiated, I was going to go, because at the time I was thinking I was going to get out. I had negotiated a set of orders where I was going to go to Northwestern University, because I grew up in Chicago. I grew up close to the Northwestern campus. And I was going to be a ROTC instructor. And I'm thinking, okay, get my MBA, and then I'll get out, and I'll go work in the city like half my buddies from high school. And that's kind of the plan, except I meet this just amazing woman one night on Liberty in a bar off my first ship, my destroyers in Annapolis. We go up to Annapolis. I meet this woman. So I go to the detailer subsequently and say, look, I need to go to Washington, not D.C., because my wife was, my now wife, 39 years later, was in a corporately fund. Her company was paying for her degree, and I didn't feel I could ask her, hey, just step away from the degree, because the company said, no, if she leaves Washington, we're not going to fund her education. So I go to my detailer and say, look, I will take any orders to get to Washington. Wow. Literally, I said to him, I will take any set of orders to get to Washington.
Man, you bit hard.
That was high risk. Right? And this guy really just jerked me around, because what he, first he's telling me I can't do that. And I'm telling him, you have no high priority fills in Washington that you have to fill. And he finally comes back and says, hey, I heard about one. It's in the Navy's Equal Opportunity Shop. Now, it turns out this guy had actually been in that same shop before. And but he lies to me. When I ask him, can you tell me about the job? He says, I don't know anything about it. So I get the orders. Now, the good news is I'm in Washington, and I'm living with my then girlfriend and then very quick fiance before we get married. And I'm thinking, I'm the Affirmative Action Plan Program Master. So I'm running the Navy's Affirmative Action Plan.
Out of headquarters? Okay, yeah.
Out of headquarters at the Annex. And I'm thinking, people don't promote out of here. You know, my career is dead. And yet, I met some amazing people who had a totally different experience that opened my eyes to a total different view of the Navy. When I had been on that destroyer and made that combat deployment and done some really interesting things, at that time, women could not serve on combatants. I had never served with another woman. I get to this job in Washington, my immediate boss is a female commander. Her boss is an African-American captain. And at the time, this is 1985, those are unusual. They were amazing people, totally different experience, totally different perspective, naval professionals though. I learned so much from them, and the tour really opened my eyes. And it reminded me subsequently, later on, I'm a captain and I get hired by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who I didn't know, but he hires me to be his thinker. I literally, General Pace, 16th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, first Marine ever to be the chairman. Great man, I have great respect for him. And I remember asking him one time, sir, what has your career taught you? What do you say to people when you get asked this? And he said, my takeaway was bloom where you're planted. Wherever they send you, do the best job you can. Because he had left. He graduates from the Naval Academy in '67. He goes through the basic school, and in February of 1968, he goes to Vietnam, and he's joining a rifle platoon in Hue City, except the Tet Offensive has started 2 days before, and his platoon has been driven out of the fortress and is now outside Hue City. And when he reports, the Marine unit is given the mission, you're going to go back in and retake Hue and take the fortress, and you're driving the North Vietnamese out. So he spends 13 months in Vietnam as a rifle platoon and rifle company commander. He finishes that tour, and they send him to recruiting in Buffalo, New York, and he's thinking, oh my God. And yet he said to me, just like my experience, he said, I learned so much, and my takeaway from that experience was bloom wherever you plan on. And I always tell that to people. If it doesn't work out the way you think, focus on what really matters. Do the best job you can, and remember the mission and the men and women you're working with.
And what I love about that story is, diversity has gotten such a bad rep to some degree lately, but here you are, you're working with toxic officers that thought that's the way that you were supposed to be. And then you got to work with different kinds of sailors that showed you what a different kind of Navy can be and helped keep you in. And yeah.
I loved listening to them. They had to deal with issues that I never had to deal with, that I had no appreciation of. It was amazing, their journeys. I thought, shit, Rogers, suck it up, man. You've had such, you got nothing to bitch about. Just focus on doing the best job you can and forget the rest of this crap.
And this is something that makes us so much stronger, I think, as a nation and as a military in our national security, because, our adversaries don't have friends and allies, right? They have other dictators that are going the same way. We're here on the sidelines of Australia, right? And working with our Australian allies and friends. We have immigrants to the country that bring the language skills. And I know at NSA how much you valued immigrants and recent immigrants because they could bring this incredible set of language skills. Neurodiverse populations that come in and are happy to just be it a problem because it engages them when other people would have faded 8 or 16 hours beforehand, because this is what just charges them up.
My grandfather was a coal miner from Wales who immigrated to the United States through Ellis Island in 1925. As a result of this tour we talked about, literally the rest of my career, I became this huge advocate for we need diversity of perspective, we need diversity of experience, we need diversity of thought, because that will make us stronger, we'll be better able, and we will execute better mission outcomes, guys. That not only is the right thing to do morally, but it'll generate better mission outcomes, and that's why we're here, okay?
Yeah, and it's a real offset for the United States, right? Being able to do something that our adversaries can't is like diving in with our allies and diving in with the richness that's American culture and life to be stronger. And especially in an increasingly uncertain world, right? If you have the diversity of thought, if you don't have the diversity of thought, if you're approaching every management problem as a screaming situation. Because honestly, that having come through the Air Force Academy, I actually got turned down for ROTC. I'm the only person I know that got turned down for ROTC.
Leading by shouting is not the best leadership.
We either had peer leadership, because it's the Air Force, right? And you're dealing with other pilots or the equivalent at the Academy, or you were screaming. And like we didn't really have anything in between. And I remember I got to my first signals intelligence unit at Anchorage Air Force Base. I'm sorry, Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage. And we were always told you're going to be in charge because you were, because you're smart, you got a degree. And my two NCOs both had master's degrees. Yeah. And I said, oh man, something's different here. So I want to dive into that because I was in Anchorage maybe a little bit before you were in Winter Harbor, but similar. So Winter Harbor, Maine, it's on, if you don't know it, it's on the beautiful part.
It is. It's in the remote section of the Acadia National Park.
Yep. So the pretty extreme northeast.
Yep. You're only about 90 miles from the maritime border with Canada. You're right on the Maine coast. So.
But the signals intelligence units that we had, so signals intelligence, this was mid to late 90s, was you had these strategic sites that was doing high frequency national sites, right? Antennas that were tens of acres, and you had tactical voice, people that were kind of listening to maybe fighter pilots or Navy ships, and you had electrical intelligence. And that was kind of it, right? There was a few data signals that were around.
Right. Telemetry and a couple data things, because in ciphered speech, et cetera, you get into that stuff.
That was relatively niche still, at least for the numbers of folks.
It wasn't as big.
And it was essentially the same kind of thing that you would have from World War I or even World War II.
It was almost like World War II, in some ways.
So can you describe a little bit of what that mission was like? And because we want to use this about how signals intelligence, how the business changed in your time in the business from this time. So if you can describe kind of that mission at Winter Harbor, because it was probably a period of transition.
So SIGINT is shaped in signals intelligence is shaped in no small part, in my experience, by the nature of the way the target communicates. Mm-hmm. And what historically we had seen was the way the targets, the Russians, others, the way the targets tended to communicate was high-frequency voice and manual Morse. You had microwave, transcontinental links that would bounce signals. So again, you had to be in the line of sight. You generally, tactical voice in the VHF and the UHF spectrum. But the other thing you always had to remember as a SIGINT professional was you can never overcome physics. So physics shapes the way radio waves travel, the distance, the amplitude, et cetera. So in general, we built systems at the time that were optimized against these radio frequency-based signals. So we built these huge whirling Webers because it used German technology from the Second World War. We called them the dinosaur cages that were designed to collect both high-frequency signals, voice and data, as well as cut lines of bearings to locate them so we could then geolocate what the unit was. We had airborne collection platforms because you had to go to where the signal was. We had, we collected on submarines, we collected on ships. The biggest difference was at that time, early, the first third of my career, it was all about you had to get where the signal was. Mm-hmm. And then two things started to change in the 90s, really. The first was the targets shifted from unique and often radio frequency-based communication signals. They went digital, they went network, and they no longer used unique hardware or software. Yeah. They went commercial. The United States did, the Russians did, all the targets did. Suddenly the target's using the same software, the same hardware that you're using. And the unique thumbprints, for example, I can still hear Russian secure voice, and I'll just hear the signal, and I'll go, that's encrypted secure UHF secure voice. Yeah. All that went away. Yeah. And so suddenly you had to change your skill set, and the skill set increasingly by the end of the 90s and the early 2000s became communications went to IP-based, internet protocol-based, network-focused means of communication. So you had to understand networks. You had to understand the digital world. Yeah. And so I can still remember computer network defense, computer network attack really starts in the late 90s, the beginning of 2000s, because again, our skill set was evolving.
Yeah, and for those that are listening, if you want to dive more into this, the NSA has released the NSA magazine at the time, the Cryptolog. And so they redacted a lot of that information and they put it out. And there's some fascinating stuff in there, early, like stuff from Bill Black and all of this great material, because NSA was really talking about it. So signals intelligence changed a ton during your career. So it was less radio frequency, all that's still out there. Right. And so I'm curious, for the people that are in the business now, right, do you think that they're going to be having the same reflection when they're doing a podcast in 30 years, right? Do you think the signals intelligence now that's network-based, it's software-based, is still going to largely be the case for 3 decades? Or, for example, is artificial intelligence going to be substantially changing the mission?
The reality is change is the nature of things. And while there was a level of change, the change took a lot longer. So, for example, in many ways, we were using the same skill sets that they used at the Battle of Midway to break the Japanese code, and that was 50 years later. Yeah. As we think I entered the Navy, I was commissioned in 1981, as we look at, so what is the environment going to be, in 2031? It isn't going to be like it was in 1981. So the difference to me is the rate of change.
Yeah. Like I was talking to one of the political risk firms, Veracity Worldwide, and like they're using AI. I thought AI would be used, might not change collection, but would change analysis and production, the creation of the reports. And, they're using, this is a political risk firm, and they're using agent-based open source collection to bring in. And I was really, maybe not surprised, but interesting to hear that AI-based collection for open source is already there.
Yeah. I think you'll see AI's applicability very broadly. Yeah. And therefore, its implications are going to be pretty deep and pretty broad. So, change is the nature of life. The good thing is, the technology changes. The mission, is pretty consistent over time. The value of people is really consistent over time. And the power and importance of good leadership, that never changes in my experience.
As you're talking about this shift from, there had been the Soviet bloc technology and the Western technology, and the two did not mix. And that change now that we are all using the same technology, it reminded me of someone that's on the NSA Hall of Fame, Hilda Matthew. Because I want more people to know about, we all know about Admiral Grace Hopper, and I don't think enough of us know about her. And because she was in the 1960s and realizing that this was going to be both a mission, a great collection mission to go after network-based information, but also a tremendous vulnerability. And I just think of how long, and she was an author of some of the most influential reports in 1972, the Anderson Report. That first looked at memory-safe languages and says the red team always gets through. One of the first statements of offense advantage that we see. If you seem to be familiar, do you have anything to share? Because I'm going to close out on something here.
It shows you, number one, when we're doing things right, it doesn't matter what your sex is, it doesn't matter what your orientation is. Hey, can you bring value to the team, man? That's all that matters to us.
Because that must have been lonely for her to be the NSA engineer, is the only woman around.
The Friedmans, very famous in signals intelligence for the 20s, the wife was also a really great mathematician and a great cryptologist. Didn't get as much attention as her husband, but there's just a great history, a great individual. I actually met Grace Hopper in the early 80s. Man, what an amazing. And then she was in her 80s when I met her, but she was still wearing her service dress blue and still coming in the Navy Annex.
I'd love to do a biography of Hilda Matthew because, as you said, we went from everyone has their separate technology, now have the same. And here you had the first person at NSA that recognized this, and the first person, according to NSA, what's on the Hall of Fame, that would hire engineers to work the mission.
Because it just goes to show you, what you need to think about. Missions have multi-dimensions. We had always been focused on, hey, how do I generate insight and knowledge from the adversary? We often didn't ask ourselves, how's the adversary going to try to generate insight and knowledge against us? And she really did. She very much argued, hey, you look at the way technology is evolving, we've got vulnerability here we're going to have to deal with.
And so, do you know what her name was before she was married?
No, I do not.
Hilda Faust. So it is the original Faustian bargain of United States.
She make a deal with the devil,
right? Where the same thing of, hey, this is going to be a great intelligence target. We need to dive in, but also we're going to be very
There's a flip side.
Yep.
There's a flip side.
So to close out, I want to talk about, especially because we're here in Australia, about intelligence and warning. Because I don't think warning gets as much attention as it needs to. And for those that don't know Australia, they had planned for decades, I think back to the 70s, of saying we're going to have at least 10 years warning before we're going to have before we're going to be in a large scale conflict. Which is, from an American perspective, just incredible that they figure they're going to have 10 years of warning. And they've just now, in the latest defense pay strategies, say we're not going to have that warning. We're within that 10-year warning window. So I'd love to expand on warning, right? How is warning different from the normal intelligence tasks that we take on? And it strikes me that as the world has gotten more complex, as we're getting closer to these militarized crises with what's happening in South China Sea and what's happening with Ukraine, it seems like warning might be getting more difficult. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
But this is a topic that I had paid great attention to, because on the trivia side, within the Department of Defense, the Director of Intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the J2 on the Joint Staff, is actually formally designated as the warning officer for DOD. When I was the JCS J2, I was the warning officer for DOD. And so you owned responsibility to articulate warning to the Joint Chiefs. And you had this entire methodology and process that we had built over time. Warning is designed, how do you take insight and knowledge generated through intelligence and apply it in a way that gives you insight as to where those indicators of a potential, we call it warning, or a significant change in an adversary's intent, capability, or readiness. And it was, hey guys, we just can't get lost in the individual data points.
Right.
So we asked ourselves, hey, what are the indicators that an adversary might be increasing their combat readiness or their combat capability? What are the indicators that might highlight to us that an adversary is making a decision to invade Ukraine, for example? What are the things that would cue us in advance, hey, there's something going on, and all these little dots we're seeing in terms of tactical intelligence activity, when you put it all together, it suggests to us that the adversary is taking the following action, and that therefore leads us to believe that the intent is to invade Ukraine, for example. And here's what they're doing to shorten their ability to do this. The whole idea of warning was, if you can do that with sufficient advance notification, you can go to a decision maker or a policy maker and say, we're seeing this change, we think this is an indicator of the following, but we think they're 2 months, 6 months, 3 weeks away from being able to do it. Increasingly, what we're finding in the world around us now is these warning windows are really compressing. And now I had to do this.
Why is that? Is that because of technology, or?
It's a combination of entities out there are changing their readiness levels and their capabilities. The traditional high visibility indicators that we used to look for, mobilization, rail movements, et cetera. In some areas, the adversary has created a structure where that's not required anymore, or they've spent a lot of time asking themselves, well, how do I mask increased preparedness? It's one reason, for example, you often will hear adversaries, if they're trying to marshal capability, if they're preparing to apply that capability in military force, oftentimes to try to shield what they're doing, they will make public statements like, it's an exercise. All these forces that we're gathering, all this activity that you're seeing, it's not designed to ensure that we're ready to execute an invasion scenario. It's a training scenario. Don't be worried. And so what you've seen is warning in many problems. That's not all. And we used to have every combatant commander. When I was the director of intelligence for Indo-Pacific Command, so when I was the intel lead for one of the global one of the regional combatant commanders, so here in the Pacific, we developed a whole different set of indicators of what? Indicators of nuclear activity in North Korea, missile launch, invasion, blockade, quarantine in Taiwan. We came up with a whole series of scenarios. And then we asked ourselves, so what would be the indicators that an adversary was potentially considering executing one of these scenarios? And we call that, hey, that's the warning problem. And in a perfect world, the whole purpose is so you're buying commanders and policymakers more time so they can make smarter decisions and they can be prepared. That is in a perfect world. But a lot of times, either you don't anticipate it, you don't see it. You've got the Yom Kippur War in 73. We'll have to see what hindsight shows us from Hamas's activity in Gaza. But clearly, if it wasn't surprise, it was certainly a lack of unpreparedness. And again, they will investigate this. They'll work their way through it.
So on one hand, cyber makes that difficult because there's no observables. But we did get it right. I mean, we totally had Putin busted, right?
Yep.
U.S. intelligence had this, and decisions from the White House that we were going to reveal the information, which I thought was really kind of staggering in how much the commitment was.
That was always one of the most powerful parts about SIGINT. SIGINT, it's not the only discipline. I'm not arguing it's the most important. But one of the ways it tended to be really valuable was when you actually are hearing from the horse's mouth, so to speak. It often was able to provide intent. We might see and detect movement, but you'd be asking yourself, but for what purpose? Well, what are they doing? And if you're going, well, I can tell you what the general staff is telling the leadership, here's what they're doing and why. It's just, that is amazing. That's when it's really something really
powerful. And just on last in this, it strikes me that part of warning has gotten so difficult when I get asked as a professor in my professional capacities, what do we think is going to happen with China or Russia? And it's so tough because now it comes down to what's in the brain of Putin or in Xi Jinping. Right? It used to be you had these institutions and you do your criminology and you'd figure out who's ascendant and who's doing what. And now, right, I mean, so many folks didn't think Russia with Ukraine because it didn't make any sense. It was all what was happening in Putin's head. And I would argue probably the same for China, right? We have dictators. And so I would think political psychology has just become really important to try and guess what's...
The other thing that's made the warning problem more complicated, we have expanded national security, the definition we use, much more broadly. So it's one thing to do warning against highly visible, highly scripted sets of activity in which we have a long-term set of experience. So we, over time, have getting a sense, this is normal, this is not normal. Hey, if you're going to conduct an amphibious assault, here's the kinds of things you have to do. Now we're being asked, as an intelligence professional, you're being asked to assess technology. You're being asked to assess economic implications. Those are much harder warning problems because there's so many variables and unknowns. And in some ways, the speed is really high, and you're trying to figure out, so what does AI mean, and what are the national security implications of going? And I used to participate in those kinds of discussions at the presidential level in my jobs, and I would be the first to admit, we'd have to tell them, hey, sir, there's some areas where we have high confidence and high knowledge, and those other areas where I'm going to have to admit, hey, we don't. Here's what we think. Here's why we think that. And oftentimes when we weren't sure, we'd say, and I remember having this discussion one time with President Obama, in one particular scenario, I said, sir, let me start with the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is really bad. And he and the entire Vice President Biden, the National Security Susan Rice, the rest of the national security team at the cabinet level, they're listening to me and they're going, oh no. And I said, well, then let me conclude with what I think is most likely. And we're going to refine our knowledge in the coming days. And I hope to be able to come back to you relatively quickly and to be able to differentiate between, I gave you the most dangerous, the worst case, and also told you what I think was most likely. In this case, what I told them was most likely is the way it worked out. That's good. But.
And I wish we had more time to get into to narrative and storytelling and how you deliver messages to policymakers. And it's because it's so interesting because so much of warning and intelligence is about degrees of uncertainty. I always cringe a bit when I'm watching a movie or something and someone in intelligence says, don't give me probabilities, tell me yes or no. And it's just no good intelligence leader ever would say that. But it's also about having decision makers that at the end of the day care about facts, even if the facts don't match what they like. So I wish we had more time to get into it.
But I do want to say, you raise a really nice point. One thing as I was trying to mentor and help in the development of others within the intelligence professional, one of the things I told them was, one of our key challenges and the ability I would respectfully suggest you really need to develop as an intelligence professional, you've got to create a story. You got to create a narrative. This happened to me it's one of these things you never know about, and then you read in the paper. You know, you get nominated to be the Derns or be cyber command. So I get I get my 4th star, and I get nominated, so it's in the newspaper. And they're trying to do background stories on who is this Rogers guy, and so they're going to some of my old bosses, and they're getting quotes from them. And when I was the J2 in Indo-Pacific Command, they go to my former boss. I was a 1-star then; he was a 4-star, and I was the director of intelligence. And they asked him, so, what about Rogers do you think is relevant to this new set of responsibilities he's going to have? And he said, they quoted him as saying, the thing that made him different to me as the commander was he really could put it together in a compelling story that helped me as a decision maker. Yeah. He didn't just give me 1,000 facts. He put it all together at the level I needed. And he would say, sir, here's what I think we're seeing, and here's why. And he wouldn't tell me, okay, sir, let's go through slide 15. Let's go through slide 16. You'll see readiness levels of the 27th Aviation Regiment in Airfield X has increased. I said, we got that if you want it, sir, but let's step back.
Oh, that's great.
Because, again, that's what he has to do. He's then got to take it to his boss, the Secretary and the President, and say, hey, here's what we're seeing out here.
Yeah. So thank you, Mike.
Thanks,
Admiral. We covered a lot about your career, about the importance of listening and being around folks that have a different mindset, about blooming where you're planted, about this fabulous field of intelligence that both gave us our big start. So thank you very much for your time.
And I hope what people take away from all this, it's never about you. It's about the mission. And I always tell, some people would always say to me in my career, isn't it about the men and women? I said, guys, if we didn't have a mission, we wouldn't have all these men and women. So let's not forget why we're here, why the taxpayers are giving us these resources. Yeah. It's to execute a mission. But every good leader knows you can't execute a mission without well-led, well-trained, and motivated men and women. Great. And that takes leadership. So never forget, mission and those men and women. It's never about you. Because when you start thinking it's about you, it is time to go home.
Yep. And so thanks to ASPE and to the sponsors. Thanks. Appreciate it, Admiral.
Thank you.